Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 News. The next 2 weekends are massive in the context of this year's championship, and upgrades are on the way for various teams. Ferrari and Mercedes both with some new ideas, especially what Ferrari are cooking up to try and turn their season around, delaying some upgrades in order to get the big one over the line. Is it going to make that much difference? What's going to happen this weekend in Monaco, because Red Bull do not expect the same result they had in Imola? Very much interested in your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. This on screen here is the new livery for the Monaco Grand Prix. I mean, look, it's still papaya, but it's actually kind of nice, I'm not going to lie. They launched it today on a yacht because, you know, it's Monaco. That's what you do, I suppose. But this is what the livery looks like for the papaya car, of course, the McLaren. How good is it going to be around Monaco? We will see. Of course, the last few years Grand Prix have been, well, varying levels of interest. Last year's was terrible, apart from the fact that Charles Leclerc won. That was a story. These are the race suits as well that Oscar and Lando are rocking with. So here they are on a yacht revealing the new livery. So this is what Formula 1 in Monaco is all about. Now, speaking of Monaco, this is Adrian Newey, and this is set to be his first Grand Prix on the grounds with Aston Martin. He said that he's going to be there and he's going to bring the notebook as well. So very interesting to see how this transpires. I mean, the last time he was at a Grand Prix, was it not Miami? Did he go to another one after Miami last year? Maybe he did. But certainly Miami last year was like the big date, of course, when he decided that was the weekend where he was stepping away from Red Bull Racing. I think he was maybe at some other ones, but of course wasn't working in the same capacity as he previously was at Red Bull after that announcement. Now he's gone to Aston Martin. Obviously, he's cooking up something on the aero side. Whether the engine will comply, as we've seen, let's say, with Red Bull in the early turbo hybrid era, that is a very different question. Monaco might be a little different this year. Well, it's certainly going to be different for a couple of reasons. As I mentioned yesterday, there is a mandate this year for every team and driver to use 3 different tyre sets. Now, critically, that's not 3 different tyre compounds, as in you don't have to run the soft, the medium and the hard. I don't, to be honest, hate that rule either, but the rule is that you have to run 3 different tyre sets. Obviously, you are mandated to use 2 different compounds anyway, so you could go hard, hard, medium, you could go medium, medium, hard, you could go soft, medium, hard if you wanted to, but, you know, you've got to use 2 compounds and you have to use 3 different sets of tyres. Now, that of course means 3 different sets, a 2-stop is mandated, unless it rains a lot, in which case I think they'll probably maybe get away with it, but it's probably not going to rain. What does it mean for strategy? As I said yesterday, if I'm right at the back of the grid, like if I'm Perez in a couple of years ago when he got lapped twice, what I'd be doing is pitting immediately and then pitting again onto a hard tyre and try and do 76 laps on a hard tyre, because you are going to undercut so many people, and it is Monaco after all, because they're going to have to double pit stop. Now, of course, a safety car would make things really strange, because if there's a safety car in the first couple of laps, guarantee you a lot of the field pits under the safety car and then pits again under the safety car. They will just box 2 laps in a row and they will use 1 tyre set for a lap. So it's going to be really strange. We'll see how it works in terms of strategy, but someone's going to do something wacky, that's for sure. And it's, well, you know, I'm sure Charles Leclerc's concerns that whatever's going to happen, it was not going to work out in his favour, because we've definitely seen that before around this circuit. At least he finally got the win there last year. But, well, McLaren, Red Bull, they'll have to be very much on their toes, because if they're not, then the questions will be there as to whether teams can capitalise on what's going to be a weird race if this strategy plays out as we might expect it to. Now, we know that Cadillac's coming in as the 11th team. There are rumours that the 12th team may arrive at some point soon as well. So Otmar Szafnauer, of course, that we know from the Alpine days, one of the individuals to, let's say, get chewed up and spit out by the Alpine operation, reportedly, he's having conversations with some what they describe as serious people to finance a 12th team. Now, I think he's talked about this for some time, but apparently for over a year now, these plans are being worked on in the background. The finances are in place. What I can tell you is that the financiers are serious people and they have the financial wherewithal to fund a Formula 1 team. The car manufacturer also wants to join a Formula 1. That is in place as well, whoever it's going to be. It's a matter of the timing being right and getting the opportunity to start it. Perhaps in the near future there might be some for sale as well, so that's an interesting possibility as well. So yeah, he doesn't reveal anything else about it. He refuses to comment on anything more, and of course there's, you know, new Concord agreement coming into effect as well. There's obviously a new owner in Cadillac coming in, so that's going to change the story as well. But yeah, very interesting work, and what that's going to look like is a very different question as well, because of course there's been theories about what Toyota might look to do, whether they're looking to come in, but if they do, they would likely just take over the Haas team, would be my guess, because they're already partnered with Toyota Gazoo Racing, as it were. Now, speaking of the race, they did a really fascinating article on what Red Bull's theories were as to what McLaren were doing with their rear tyres, because yesterday we talked about the technical directive that came in that effectively clarified what you can and cannot do. Now, McLaren say, and the FIA apparently sources say, that McLaren didn't have to change anything for Imola, but as we said yesterday, it was a big talking point, right, because they issued a TD, and then all of a sudden Red Bull win the race and McLaren don't. So obviously we're going to talk about what that might potentially mean. Now, these are the theories. Now, Red Bull proposed these theories to the FIA and said, hey, what if they're doing this? Would it be allowed? And the FIA said, no, 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 no. Maybe for the final one. That's very interesting, right? So it's fascinating what Red Bull say, because obviously we've been talking about this now for a little bit of time, these whole phase-changing materials and all this. But as I said at the time, if we're, as a community, talking about that, the teams have been deep diving on this probably weeks, if not months before, and preparing some sort of document for the FIA to say, okay, hey, if they're doing this, can we get them banned, please? Now, as I've said before, as is often the case with Red Bull, if there's some drama around something like this and they have said, oh, this team might be doing something dodgy, it's usually because Red Bull have tried it themselves and they, realize it was illegal, or they, don't seem to find a way to get away with it, basically. So they were talking about some options. Could you have skins in the wheel assembly that were fluid filled? And that was one of the proposals, because it wouldn't be quite the same as cooling them through liquid, but the FIA basically said, okay, look, even if the reservoirs are sealed, then it doesn't matter, because liquid cooling of the brakes is forbidden. And they also say it would contravene Article 10.8.4d, which states that any device, system or procedure, except for driving the car, is illegal if it helps to heat the wheels, hubs or brakes, or maintain their temperature. So those are the two key articles, really. And basically all of Red Bull's proposals of what McLaren might have been doing, the FIA said, no, you can't do that, you can't do that, you can't do that, based on these same things. So they had the idea about having a fluid reservoir within the wheel bodywork, which would look something like this, and the FIA say it's going to fall foul of Article 11.5, so you can't do that. Fluid hidden in mechanical components, where the fluid would be here somewhere, and they say you can't do that because it's going to be illegal cooling of the brakes as well, using liquid, which you can't do. So, then there was a crazy theory that Red Bull apparently had, that which is not honestly crazy, just because this is Formula 1, right? Like, anything goes, and the teams will try anything, but I thought it was a remarkable idea, and it's clearly something that Red Bull themselves have thought about doing, but presumably aren't doing right now. And that is using the drink that the driver drinks for some other purpose, right? So we know that the driver typically will take on some water allowance for them to actually drink during a Grand Prix, and the water's typically replaced right by the engine, so it's boiling hot, really, a lot of the water that the guys are drinking. But there is no rule that that water has to just be for the driver, so maybe you could find a way to reroute the water through the brakes to cool it down. But again, the FIA told Red Bull, you can't do that, it's going to break the same rules as we've done before, but however interesting that idea was. The real interesting idea, though, is using things that aren't fluid, right? Because this is what we discussed on the phase or the phase-changing materials, the idea of using something which isn't necessarily a liquid, maybe is actually a solid, but changes phase in between states, and therefore can absorb energy in the process to change the bonds in the material. That's something that is very interesting, even if it's not changing between solid and liquid. And this is another interesting idea as well. So the concept is thermoelectric cooling using what they describe as a Peltier device. Now, we'll have a look at what they look like in a second. But effectively, the idea is to use a couple of different semiconductors that exchange heat in different ways, and therefore you can create, using electrical currents, a cooling or a heating effect. So there's a rule that says Article 15.4.1 of the technical regulations outlaws the shape-changing materials that some had suggested that could be employed, as we discussed, but are actually illegal for use in such circumstances. The rule states any shape memory materials, except for a specific one, electrical sensors, are banned totally in F1, and there's an exception that maybe, if these piezoelectric materials are true that could help cool the electrical sensors, could they be used as well? So this is pretty interesting, right? So you've got these certain materials that are allowed in the rules, but they're typically used to cool the sensors. Could you use them to cool the wheel bodywork as well? And what's interesting is that the FIA's response to this suggestion from Red Bull wasn't, oh no, you can't do it. It was, well, I don't know, maybe you could. It would just be difficult to do. So the idea is that a sensor would fall under the definition of being a device used for measuring a physical property. If such a device made significant changes to a system, the FIA would consider it to be an actuator, and such a piezoelectric device would not be exempted and therefore illegal. But a separate suggestion of Red Bull using what's called a Peltier device, which I think is how it's pronounced, might be wrong, in this area, has not had the pushback. So effectively, this is what it looks like. You've got these two plates. Maybe this is a better diagram. I don't know. I'm not really familiar with these because I didn't do physics on quite this level. So, you've got two different semiconductor elements and a metal plate and current running, basically, that will either absorb or radiate heat, depending on the properties of these two materials and the current that is running through them. That, as far as I understand it, is the long and the short of it, fundamentally. So there's an ability here to use an electrical current to absorb heat, effectively, by using some of these special materials. And these materials are allowed in the right circumstances. So the idea is it possible to use some of these devices within the wheel assembly in order to, use currents from somewhere anyway to then take up some of the heat from the brakes? I don't know. Maybe it's possible. Is it what McLaren are doing? I actually find it really rather unlikely. But it is nonetheless a suggestion, and the rumour has it that using electrical currents, the square or rectangular blocks that make up the Peltier devices could be attached in areas where other cooling or heating is required. You can switch between the two actions by changing the currents. So with reference to the quest to reduce temperatures inside the wheel bodywork, a design could incorporate having these devices fitted somewhere in the assembly that could be used to cool things down. As there are no moving parts on them, they conform to the rules, and the FIA's response says, "We believe the use of Peltier devices for cooling in this area is not covered by the technical regulations, but would not consider it favourably and would seek to specifically exclude it for 2026. So that's very interesting, isn't it? The FIA have effectively said, we didn't think of that, and we're going to ban it next year, but technically right now you could possibly do it. So are McLaren doing it? I feel like it's quite unlikely, really. I mean, this seems pretty out there to me. But look, it's something that Red Bull thought of that McLaren might be doing, and when put to the FIA, they told them, well, they possibly could be. And if Red Bull thought of it as an option, maybe McLaren have thought of it as well. So, look, if that's what they're doing, which probably they're not, in my just estimation, but if they are, then what do you do about it? Because now they're getting effectively told it's going to be banned next year. Red Bull, if they worked on something similar, would it be enough to make a difference? Like, would it work? I mean, it's obviously very risky to, in terms of, bringing the temperatures down. I mean, it might only help them for a few races, even if they could figure it out. And then it's probably banned for next year anyway. So intrigued to your thoughts on that. Again, as always, Formula 1 continues just to be absolutely fascinating. But I will say that Red Bull are not convinced that it's going to be quite as strong in Monaco. Its strengths do seem to be in the high-speed corners. It tends to be really good. They were much better, I think, than they were expecting to be on some level in Imola. Of course, they did bring an upgrade as well. The McLaren wasn't quite as good on its tyres, potentially because they were using the softer compounds, and that's the same story in Monaco. So, look, I don't think Monaco will be as good as Imola for Red Bull. I doubt it, but it could still be solid. And we know that Max is great around there. I mean, of course, that final sector he put in a couple of years ago against Alonso still lives large in the memory. And Red Bull do believe that the technical directive in Spain will impact McLaren's performance. So, at the end of the day, Max is only 20-ish points behind Oscar in the championship. As long as Monaco isn't a complete disaster, and then Spain maybe makes a bit of progress for them, the championship is very much still alive, and I think that there is still a degree, a little bit to me, where McLaren feel like they're fighting one another. But, obviously they're aware that Max is still there, but, I don't think that what we saw from Piastri and Imola was, quite aggressive enough compared to the fact that Max is very much still in this championship fight. Now, a team that is not in the championship fight is Ferrari. This is a pretty funny video that came out. I mean, you might think it's too far, but I thought it was hilarious personally. Charles in 2024 diving in to the yacht club harbour, having won the Grand Prix. Charles in 2025 diving off the top rock down into the Monaco harbour. Or you know what I'm saying anyway. Now, the reason why this is funny is because Charles Leclerc apparently liked this post, which is pretty hilarious. Because, we know that Charles is feeling a certain type of way about this season. A few things that Ferrari are working on. The main one is this rear suspension change that they're working on, because their issue is in some of the low-speed corners, getting the traction to work properly, even though that's been a strength of theirs over the last few years. And according to some reports anyway, in Imola, they figured out that they can make a compromise to have good race pace even with this current limitation, but they will sacrifice quali pace and, sacrifice quali pace to a large degree, to such a degree that they were both out in Q2. They recovered well in the Grand Prix. Of course, they were helped by safety cars, VSCs and stuff to get into the position they were, and nearly scored a podium with Hamilton. It was maybe on with another few laps, of course, given the fact that Piastri didn't have another set of tyres. But still, it's not great for Ferrari. I mean, they were out in double Q2 despite having a positive Sunday and their race pace being solid. And in Monaco, we know that, qualifying pace is everything, right? Like, you can't afford to qualify down the field, and I'm sure Leclerc will be absolutely sending it as much as he possibly can to try and score a position as high up as he possibly can for his home race. But I don't know how likely that is. So, a rear suspension change is coming. We know that Ferrari, they made the bold call to change their suspension in the final year of the regulations. It was, as I say, bold, to say the very least. Now, of course, ideally, that was going to work beautifully. The reality is it didn't, and they changed their front suspension, and it's obviously had knock-on effect. Now they want to change the rear. So, there were aero developments on the works that effectively look to increase downforce, right? Small bits here and there to just, bump up the downforce of the car without affecting the overall stability of it. But that's not the big problem, right? As we know, because Adrian Newey said at year one of the regulations, the most important thing in these regs is the suspension, getting the proper mechanical platform. And still, Ferrari, here we are at the final year of the regulations, they've not got the suspension right. Now, they've changed it around a couple of times. Maybe they should have just stuck with it, what they had last year, but no, they went for the pull rod. They've got the same rear, but it's obviously not working for them this time because of the changes that they've made. That's what they're going to develop. So that's the rumour anyway, that they're freezing some of these aero upgrades. They're freezing some of the, what they deem unnecessary or just small performance enhancements to make sure they fix the rear suspension. So initially, the rear suspension, we talked about it being ready for Silverstone. Of course, that's a few Grand Prix away. We've got Monaco, we've got Spain, we've then got, of course, like Canada's coming up in the middle of June. There is Austria, and then there's Silverstone. I think those are the next few Grand Prix. And they'll hope to try and fast track it as quick as they possibly can. Maybe try and get it ready for Canada in the middle of June. That might be as early as they could really muster. But that's the intention anyway. Then, if that works, then they can consider adding some downforce. But it is interesting for Ferrari because what they're saying is that actually, no, these changes are necessary for our understanding for 2026. So that's how they're justifying it anyway. And Mercedes, they're also bringing upgrades. I think that Imola, I expected to be much stronger for them, to be fair. I thought that with a couple of upgrades on the car, they would actually be a threat, but frankly they weren't, and Ferrari were much faster on the day. So, again, it might be a little bit of same old for Mercedes. I think that Hamilton's feeling on whether he should have stayed or gone, I don't think he really regrets anything, and I don't think he frankly ever will. I think joining Ferrari is just something that he couldn't say no to. But I'm sure his thoughts weekend by weekend have kind of gone back and forth and to and fro because he's like, damn, Mercedes are actually cooking this year. Here's Antonelli with the pole. And then all of a sudden, Ferrari are back to doing okay and Merc looking no man's land again with terrible tyre wear. So that's a problem. But there's a new floor in Barcelona, right? So teams are bringing more upgrades. Barcelona's going to be a big one for multiple upgrades and multiple teams. And you've got the technical directive as well. So it doesn't get more chaotic than that in a couple of weekends' time. Ferrari, Mercedes bringing some changes. But I think many of us are waiting for, like, a McLaren going to do much? Are they going to bring some upgrades for the upcoming weekends? Because the technical directive that kicks in Spain, that may change the tide, but Red Bull have brought a fair few things now. You're thinking McLaren have got something they're cooking up anyway, and maybe they can respond with a big upgrade at some point that's going to put Verstappen again on the back foot. But kind of crazy that if Verstappen was to get pole in Monaco, he is going to lead more laps than anyone for the entire season, which is kind of remarkable that, Lando's led 60, Oscar's led 168, Max has led 142, and Leclerc, Antonelli, Hamilton, Albon are the other names on this pretty prestigious list. So very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.